The fear of blood tends to create fear for the flesh. The sentence that introduced Silent Hill to the world can be interpreted in many ways, but the one that feels the most obvious to me is as a guiding principle for the 1999 original's visual aesthetic. The intended experience was to instill players with a visceral fear for their own flesh, and to that end, the other world is covered in blood. Speaking as someone who didn't grow up with a PS1 and only recently started going back through the system's catalog, Silent Hill 1 is easily its most visually striking game, at least from my limited experience. And I think this comes down to the strong guiding principle in the aforementioned opening sentence. It makes it all the more interesting that when the time came for a sequel, Team Silent opted for a vastly different visual style, toning down the excesses of blood and rust in favor of a colder color palette. That being said, I wouldn't say they abandoned the intent of creating the visceral fear for the flesh. Instead, I'd argue that much like the visuals became more muted, so too did this horror become subtler. More so than win states or player challenge, interactivity is the defining characteristic of video games as an art form. In the context of a horror experience, it's easy to see how it can enhance things. You're no longer shouting at other characters not to go into the creepy basement, you're doing it yourself. Silent Hill 2 is widely considered one of, if not the best, horror game ever made, and in this video I want to argue how it achieved such ubiquitous status was in large part a product of how it handled the ever-important element of interactivity in a completely new way. Two disclaimers before we get started. First, this video will touch on topics of sexual violence and suicide, so if those are difficult subjects for you, you might want to skip this one. And second, this video will contain spoilers and is better understood if you've played the game, so you've been warned. One of Silent Hill 2's most well-known features is its approach to the enemy designs. If you ignored the previous warning, I'll give you one more chance to turn this video off if you don't want to be spoiled about SH2's plot, so here's your final warning. As I was saying, the game's monsters have been discussed extensively online, but in case you're unfamiliar, each of the 9 enemy types in the game is a symbolic representation of James's feelings towards multiple aspects of his life during the years Mary was sick, feelings that eventually led him to suffocate her to death with a pillow. The lying figure is a creature trapped in its own body. The resemblance to a human in a straitjacket is indicative of James' deteriorating mental state, but also a symbol for how Mary felt about herself. She mentions in her letter that she feels trapped in a cocoon of loneliness. The creature attacks by vomiting, which is also indicative of disease and disgust. The mannequins bring the female sexual aspect of the monsters to the forefront. The lying figure is more subtle about it, with its feet resembling high heels, but the mannequin drives the point home by attaching 2 sets of female legs together at their torso. This creature is a representation of James's sexual frustration, unable to be intimate with his wife. The fact the mannequin is a lifeless object made of nothing but legs, coupled with the way the monster is practically more object than creature, is indicative of James's objectifying views towards women as tools of sexual gratification. This also extends to the bubblehead nurses, with the added context of the hospital setting. We can presume that James looked at other women at the hospital Mary was in with lust, considering the creature's exposed cleavage. Like the mannequin with their absent upper body, the absence of a face on these women makes them feel a lot more like sexual objects than people. The meaning behind the mandarins is kind of difficult to pin down. It seems mostly connected to their placement below the ground, hanging by a thread with the constant threat of the abyss looming below them, ready to swallow them up. This could be how James felt about Mary during the years she was sick. This being that's not allowed to live a full life, but is still hanging on until the last possible moment. The flesh lips are fleshy messes constrained within a metal frame, which can be interpreted to be Mary trapped in her hospital bed. Its primary method of attacking is by using its mouth, which many have associated with Mary's verbal abuse of James. This is given extra credence in my mind because after they are killed, as the player is put on a hospital bed and wheeled into the other world, we hear Mary's voice call out to James.
James.
so it seems there is some association between the monster and Mary's speech. The abstract daddy is a representation of sexual abuse Angela suffered at the hands of her father and possibly her brother too. At first, this seems to put into context the idea that every monster is a delusion from James, but Takayoshi Sato, who worked on the game's computer graphics and character art, stated the monster we see is what James sees, but Angela actually sees something different. The creature's design is abstract enough that it can easily fit Angela's assault just as much as James suffocating Mary. As such, the abstract daddy seems to symbolize masculine aggression in more general terms. Which brings us to the series' most iconic enemy, Pyramid Head. There are two sides to this creature, one as a representation of James's sexual frustration and another as a representation of his desire to be punished for his sins. Starting with the first aspect, it's important to note that, along with the abstract daddy, Pyramid Head is one of only two monsters that exhibit typically masculine characteristics. And much like its only male counterpart, this creature also displays a tendency towards sexual assault. Out of the 5 cutscenes where Pyramid Head is prominently featured in, 4 of them contain sexual content of some kind, ranging from the symbolic stabbing of Maria with phallic weapons in 2 of them, to the implied sexual assault of the other creatures in our first 2 encounters with it. Other creatures which, I remind you, have typically feminine legs. What this behavior says about this monster can't be properly understood without discussing his role as a manifestation of self-punishment for James. Through the aforementioned killings of Maria, Pyramid Head makes James relive the pain of seeing his wife die. I've seen interpretations that it's trying to guide him to confront the truth of his actions, but even after James has already remembered everything, they continue to kill Maria to torture him. If you're familiar with the in-water ending, then you know self-punishment is something that has been lingering in James's mind throughout the entire game, and so Pyramid Head is an agent of that guilt. The monster's existence is so intrinsically tied to James's crime that once he kills another human being, a new Pyramid Head shows up alongside the original. After the final battle against the two, we can see that they were each carrying one egg. One of those is a vivid red, while the other is rusted. These 2 items symbolize the murders of Eddie and Mary respectively, and their coloring indicates the time passage between one murder and the other through the image of fresh blood and coagulated blood. The 2 aspects of the creature make evident one of the core tenets behind the design of all enemies in the game, a combination of sex and death. In the Silent Hill 2 documentary, Sato states the following.
Psychological horror has to shake humans' heart, deeply. Shaking people's heart deeply means, uncover people's core emotion and their core motivation for life. Everybody is thinking and concerning about, sex and death every day. And if we want to scare or shake or touch the users or spectators, then we have to think about sex and death deeply to make like a death scene. Somebody died or monsters died, or if we made that kind of scene, we try to mix erotic essence. This is kind of a visual and core concept.
Pyramid Head is the culmination of this line of thinking from the developers. A line of thinking that seems to draw more than a little inspiration from Freudian psychoanalysis, particularly the concept of Eros and Thanatos instincts. To put it simply, Eros encompasses all instincts that seek to perpetuate life, including hunger, thirst, self-preservation, and most importantly for us, sex. These instincts are juxtaposed by what Freud calls the death drive, our unconscious desire for death and destruction. which, for our purposes, can manifest itself in self-harm and carelessness, both of which James demonstrates multiple times throughout the game.
It's just, I guess I really don't care if it's dangerous or not. I'm going to town either way.
That's how the monsters of Silent Hill 2 managed to be so unsettling. They combined these primordial opposite aspects of the human psyche into distinct, horrifying creatures, all of which have sexual elements displayed alongside decayed, or as the devs put it, soured flesh. They serve as a means of delivering a deep character study of James on one hand, while aiming to also tackle a sort of universal horror through the use of Freudian psychology. The developers want players to be unsettled on a personal level. Pyramid Head in particular is an amalgam of all the thoughts James wants to keep suppressed about himself, which, when paired with the Freudian influence we've just discussed, seems like it would make the monster a perfect candidate for a representation of another Freudian concept called the id. But given others' interpretations of its ambiguous role as a sort of guide for James, I think Pyramid Head would fit better with the Jungian concept of the shadow. Both concepts are similar in the sense that they are parts of our psyches that contain all the traits we and society find unacceptable about ourselves. Because of this, these contents are usually shoved into the unconscious part of our minds, where we don't have to face realities that we don't like about ourselves. However, they have the tendency to bubble up to the surface in unexpected outbursts. And in the case of the shadow, the only way of dealing with these contents is to embrace them, accept them as part of yourself in the journey to become whole. There's a lot more to it than that, but I already explored the concept of the shadow way more thoroughly in my Celeste video, so maybe check that out if you're interested. All of this is to say that all the enemies, but especially Pyramid Head, are a part of James, which explains why the two Pyramid Heads kill themselves after James has accepted the truth of his actions, regardless of what he chooses to do after that. As disturbing as they can be, Pyramid Heads are not the town's trump card against James. That role is played by Maria. What's most interesting about her, I think, is how her personality molds itself around the desires of the main character. At first, she starts off sexy, sarcastic, and confident. In other words, a version of Mary that exudes everything Mary hasn't been for the last 3 years. Her personality continues unchanged until she has to lay down at Brookhaven Hospital. I love the subtlety here. After she makes a suggestive comment about how comfortable the bed is, James has a moment of pause before saying, "I'm gonna go look for her." And then he has to clarify he means Laura and not Mary, the person who was actually on his mind. This sudden hangover is the first overt sign that Maria is starting to resemble Mary in more ways than just her face. After the pair reunites, still at the hospital, Maria embodies Mary's personality even more by berating James for abandoning her, before breaking down, asking him to keep her safe. Her inexplicable concern for Laura is also something we'll come to understand later as another trait originated from Mary. At the Historical Society, the supernatural element of Maria becomes a lot more obvious, as players just saw her getting stabbed to death by Pyramid Head a few minutes ago. It is here that her personality shifts become even more evident.
You were always so forgetful. Remember that time in the hotel?
Maria?
You said you took everything, but you forgot that videotape we made. I wonder if it's still there.
How do you know about that? Aren't you Maria?
I'm not your Mary.
She changes from demure Mary to suggestive Maria with such ease that it's clear some sort of manipulation is going on, and at least a part of James seems into it, but I'll talk more about that a bit later. At the end of the game, in the final boss arena, Maria is even wearing Mary's clothes and hair. But as James realizes his crimes, he understands Maria can't replace the woman he loved. I like to think Maria's gradual transformation into Mary displays the mental process James is going through during the game. At the beginning, he wishes Mary could have satisfied his desires better, but as he gets to spend more time with this idealized version of his wife he built up in his mind, he realizes that he actually misses the real Mary. And so Maria tries to accommodate that desire more and more, but ultimately fails to do so. At least that's what happens in 2 out of the 3 possible endings for a first-time playthrough. Because another ending sees James embrace Maria as a replacement for his wife, and the final boss is replaced with a manifestation of Mary that confronts James about her murder. This enemy is, like the others we've discussed, a projection from his mind, so it means that this version of James, who's so quick to replace his wife and brush his crimes under the rug, imagines Mary as this vengeful person, quick to throw his mistakes at his face. The final boss appearance remains consistent whether it is Mary or Maria we're fighting. They're similar to the flesh lips, but with a more religious motifs in the form of a fleshy constraint around their head that resembles a nun's habit, and their pose resembling an upside-down crucifixion. All of this coupled with the characters' names being the name of the Mother of Christ, of course. It's curious that the theme of religion only pops up here at the very end of the game. I think it could be meant as a perversion of Mother Mary as a symbol of salvation. Whichever path James chooses to follow, he's decided the person he meets at this final confrontation is not the one who's going to fix his problems anymore. This is punctuated emphatically by the game, making us deal the coup de grace after the battle has been won. Almost like James is putting the final nail in the coffin of what either Mary or Maria represents to him. While Mary only becomes a monster as a manifestation of a very specific version of James, regardless of the ending, she still appears as a fabrication of his unconscious at the end of every path. It's an illusion that serves to confirm whatever decision our protagonist made after uncovering the truth. On Twitter, Masahiro Ito, the game's monster designer, stated the 9 red squares that decorate the Japanese box art as well as the game's final save point are related in some way to the 9 delusions James encounters in Silent Hill. Those being the lying figure, the mannequin, the bubblehead nurse, the Mandarin, the flesh lip, the abstract daddy, the pyramid head, Maria, and finally, Mary. He went on to say the 3x3 arrangement of the squares is also related to James' memories no longer being repressed. The meaning of the red squares is still a subject of debate amongst fans of the game. My first interpretation for it was that because of their glossy reflections, they were meant to be photographs. I think this interpretation would fit the theme of repressed memories quite well. But then, after seeing online how the texture of the square is actually more reminiscent of crumpled paper, it seems more logical to me that they are meant to represent bloody napkins instead. Coughing was the earliest symptom of Mary's disease, so it's not a stretch to assume that a bloody napkin could be the moment the couple realized that this was a more serious illness. The glossy surface that threw me off could have been intended as a way of making the paper look wet. If that's the case, it could be that the napkin became a symbol for the moment James's life turned upside down, which would explain his painful reaction to seeing it for the first time. Another interesting idea is related to the meaning of the square in alchemy and Jungian psychology. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right, but Max Derritt made a fantastic video about this, which I'll have a link in the description. Basically, it's about a concept called squaring the circle. In alchemy, it means to create matter out of nothing, which Jung related to making the unconscious conscious. Anyways, it's really interesting stuff. Check out his video if you haven't already. The red squares prove that discussing the symbolism in Silent Hill 2 should not stop at the enemy design, so I would like to talk about other recurring symbols that pop up that I've seen less discussion about. The first one is the symbol of the bed. It shows up in enemy designs we've discussed already, like the flesh lips, the abstract daddy, and the final boss, but it's also found in other significant places. First, when Maria lays down at Brookhaven Hospital, as I mentioned earlier, it's both evocative of Mary being bedridden as well as James' repressed sexuality. I don't think it's an accident that the flesh lips appear shortly after that interaction. The next time we see this symbol, it will be in an even more explicit interaction with Maria at the Historical Society. She's behind bars, tantalizingly close, yet unreachable. This is a clear parallel to Mary being sexually unavailable on account of being sick. Maria suggests James comes meet her on the other side where they can share a bed together. This scene emphasizes the ambiguity of the bed as a symbol for James's most primal desire, but also a prison of his own making. He killed Maria on her bed after all, and it's in it that he will face her one last time, regardless of what outcome awaits him. Another important symbol is that of water. It is a symbol commonly associated with the unconscious, which fits right at home with the game's story. Looking at it in this manner, it's understandable why Pyramid Head recedes into the waters after our first fight with it. Water is also a prevalent element in this part of Silent Hill. Symbolically, James needs to cross a massive body of water before reaching his destination and the truth that lies in it. The hotel even becomes a water-damaged version of itself after the truth is unveiled. I think most interestingly, however, is the idea of water as a means of suffocation. Death by asphyxiation is alluded to in a few moments throughout the game. The gallows and the hanged man puzzle at the Historical Society are two examples. Another one is the story of the little Baroness ship which sank under Toluca Lake. Maria's clothing is famously ripped straight from Christina Aguilera's outfit at the Teen's Choice Awards, but one twisted little detail is the addition of a choker collar. And of course, we have the in-water ending in which James takes his own life by drowning. I'm building up to the discussion of how interactivity is a key aspect of Silent Hill 2's success, so I want to make it clear that there's a dual purpose to the use of symbolism in the game. First, as a tool to deepen James Sunderland's character, and second, as a tool to get under the player's skin in subtle ways, almost as a means of disarming our defenses in order to analyze our behavior under the circumstances it presents us, and most importantly, the path we choose, even when we don't know we're choosing one. In Silent Hill 2, the player is secretly responsible for determining James's fate. Despite not telling us of said responsibility, we can't fault the game for not presenting us with the consequences of each path, even if we don't know it at the time. There are 3 possible endings on a first playthrough of Silent Hill 2, and these possibilities map pretty well into the 3 sinners summoned by the town. The Maria ending is represented by Eddie, In Water is represented by Angela, and Leave by James himself. Before discussing these 3 characters in more detail, I just want to point out how often the number 3 comes up during a playthrough. Most of the main locations we visit in Silent Hill contain a puzzle which involves collecting 3 items. 3 coins in the apartment, 3 tablets at the Historical Society, and 3 music boxes in the hotel. Only the hospital breaks this rule. 3 is also the number of times James sticks his hand in unnerving and weird places in the apartments, but that's neither here nor there really. The tablets at the Historical Society are particularly interesting because much like the endings, they map into the 3 characters called to Silent Hill. The gluttonous pig, the seductress, and the oppressor represent Eddie, Angela, and James respectively. They seem to be descriptive of their deepest insecurities. That's the general vibe of the Historical Society as a whole, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. We first meet Eddie in the apartments where he's puking after presumably killing the person at this apartment's kitchen, though he unpromptedly denies it as soon as he notices James. At this point, it seems Eddie is having a literal gut reaction to his first kill, even if it's probably just a Silent Hill manifestation and not a real person. A detail I never knew about is the room next to the bathroom where Eddie is full of professional football posters. This is our first hint at Eddie's torment and our first taste of how nightmares in Silent Hill can sometimes intersect. Each time we meet him afterwards, it becomes increasingly clearer he's done something terrible and is kind of okay with it. It culminates at the end of the Historical Society, where he flat out admits to killing a dog and enjoying it, as well as shooting a football player in the knee, which presumably bullied Eddie, tying things back to the posters near our first encounter. The design of this room shows us a glimpse of what Eddie's nightmare looks like. It resembles a refrigerator, symbolic of his relationship with food. Hanging from the meat hooks are pieces of meat that resemble Eddie's body type and shorts, evocative of the gluttonous pig his tablet depicted. If his nightmare is related to his body image, we can interpret that the corpses Eddie murdered are the equivalent of the monsters we face in the game, but probably more verbally abusive to prey on his insecurities. Silent Hill 2's main theme is guilt and the many ways people deal with it. Eddie's response to being confronted with the horrors of Silent Hill is to give in to his delusions. Instead of admitting his wrongdoings, Eddie doubles down. He takes the completely wrong lessons from his time in Silent Hill and decides that violence is the only proper response to his bullies. In his eyes, he was justified all along.
From now on, if anyone makes fun of me, I'll kill him! Just like that.
This is similar to the way James behaves in the Maria ending. The final boss is replaced with Mary, and James kills her once again, symbolically embracing his decision. He projects a version of Mary that's violent and monstrous, justifying his sins in his mind. At the end, he accepts Maria as a replacement, giving in to his idealized sexual desires. But much like Eddie's embrace of his sins ended in tragedy for him, James's embrace of Maria seems to put him on a track to relive the trauma he lived with Mary, since there's an extra emphasis placed on Maria suddenly coughing on their way out of Silent Hill. His line delivery here is pretty chilling too.
You'd better do something about that cough.
If you ask me, this version of James fully accepts his role as the true villain of the story. If Eddie's way of dealing with guilt was to deny it, Angela's is to wallow in it. We first meet her at the cemetery, where the camera frames her in a way where it almost seems like she's rising from her grave. She looks a lot older than she's meant to be, being voiced by a much older actress than someone in her late teens. Her clothes conceal as much of her body as possible, suggesting a more reserved personality. She's looking for her mother, but states she thought her brother and father were here. We later find out Angela killed her father for sexually abusing her, and we can presume her brother was also killed for the same reason. The fact she's looking for her mother seems to indicate her desire for revenge isn't quite done yet. We know Angela's mother blamed her for the abuse, so it's not a stretch to assume she would be a target too. Angela killed her father with a kitchen knife, and when we next see her, she will be staring at the same weapon in front of a mirror. Layers of reflections upon reflections as she contemplates suicide. She talks about deserving to die for her sins and equates herself to James, something which he is almost too quick to deny. This also happens again on their final encounter. She displays fear when James tries to get close, a behavior commonly associated with people who have suffered the kind of trauma she has. She gives us her knife here, not to be used as a weapon as one would expect, but for what it symbolizes, the desire to take one's own life. This is a key item in getting the in water ending, which we'll talk more about in a bit, but for now, keep in mind she wanted to use the same weapon she used to kill her father as a means of killing herself. At the Historical Society is where we learn of Angela's past abuse. The room where we find her is different from what we've been seeing up to that point, and much like how Eddie's room taunted him with his body image issues, this room also taunts Angela with rhythmic pistons on the fleshy walls, symbolizing her abuse. The TV here is a sinister touch that adds to the domestic characteristic of the abuse she suffered at the hands of her family. Angela seems to know something is up with James's lie about his dead wife. I think this could either be because of her untrusting nature or because she stumbled upon things that reveal James's past just the same way we stumbled upon the newspaper that reveals her past. The last time we'll meet Angela, she asks for her knife back, clearly signaling her desire to end her life. And at the end of the scene, she walks into the flames. The most common interpretation is that this cutscene symbolizes Angela killing herself.
It's hot as hell in here.
You see it too. For me, it's always like this.
If you ask me, Angela's crime is more than well justified, and I would hope anybody who does the kinds of things her family did to her just burns in hell. That's just to say that when I say Angela's guilt, I don't really think she's guilty of anything terrible. The guilt that Silent Hill preys on is the person's internal guilt. And growing up in an environment where even her mother didn't take her side, Angela has been conditioned to think it's all her fault. As I mentioned earlier, Angela's story relates to James the most in the in-water ending. Both can't go past what they've done and end up taking their own lives. Much like how Angela is looking for her mother, thinking that once she's dead, Angela will finally be able to rest, James journeys through Silent Hill thinking that if he can just find Mary, all of his guilt will wash away. His crime won't be anything but a bad dream. In a way, both came to the town with a delusional objective that they believed would bring them peace, and both failed. In the apartments, Angela was thinking about taking her life with the same weapon she used to kill her father. This is not exactly true for James in this ending, but he does end up suffocating himself, similar to how he asphyxiated Mary. Both died struggling for air.
Now we can be together.
So far, the ways the game explored the topic of guilt have been pretty bleak. Either you pretend you were never wrong, or you succumb to it. Thankfully, there is one more option the game explores: redemption. We're introduced to the world of Silent Hill 2 on a decrepit roadside public restroom. James Sunderland is looking in the dirty mirror. His eyes are shrouded in darkness, and he touches his face almost as if to check if he's not dreaming. He goes outside, and we're fed his version of the events that led him to the town. Of course, if you're watching this video, you know James is lying to us. Not that he doesn't believe what he's saying, but this whole introduction makes me feel like, as the players, we are meant to represent James's new personality. We are the part of his consciousness that believes what he's telling us. We experience his fears and his confusion along the journey, but all throughout there are hints that there's a disconnect between what he knows and what he's told us. One of the most striking ways in which Silent Hill 2 visually differs from its predecessor is in the design of the Otherworld, but we don't get to see what that looks like until we reach the hospital, the game's second level. After killing the flesh lips, the game goes into first person. James is put on a hospital bed and wheeled out to the courtyard. This whole sequence is very weird. We hear Mary call out to James, which puts the whole perspective into question, but regardless, after we regain control, the hospital has been changed. Instead of the rust and blood aesthetic of the first game, this time all walls are covered in a sort of tarp. It fits well with the nightmare of someone who's trying to hide from the truth. Interestingly enough, each level of the game has a different version of the Otherworld. The hospital showcases the brilliance of the static camera angles pretty well in its final stretch, when Pyramid Head shows up to chase after the player and Maria down a corridor. The quick cuts around every corner almost makes it feel like you're traversing a labyrinth, even though the path is strictly linear. This is actually more interesting than just an aesthetic choice, however. This labyrinth idea is revisited in the Historical Society, and it is once again the place where Pyramid Head shows up unannounced. These labyrinthian structures are symbolic of James's torn consciousness between the desire to be punished and the desire to deny culpability, represented by Pyramid Head and Maria respectively. These are also the paths Angela and Eddie went down, as we discussed earlier. Speaking of environmental symbolism, the Historical Society is probably the densest location of the game in that regard. We've already discussed the glimpses into the nightmares of Angela and Eddie, but there's still more to this place. Fittingly, this is the place where history is unearthed. It's not only where we learn the past of Angela and Eddie, but also of the town itself. The initial descent is immediately illogical, as we are geographically below the lake and the horn of the little Baroness signals we are entering the Otherworld. The paintings on the walls hint at the origin of Pyramid Head as a symbol of punishment for James. They also tell us about the old prison the town used to have, emphasizing that the place has been torn down just shortly before we get to visit it ourselves. At this point, both time and space have lost all meaning. Visiting the historical prison of the past carries some additional symbolism for James. This place taunts its victims with their past, as we've seen with the side characters, and things wouldn't be different for our protagonist. In the prison, there's one particular cell which doesn't open back up after you go inside, kind of implying this is where James belongs. We also see a gallows in the courtyard, imagery that will be reinforced by the Hanged Man puzzle later on. But the labyrinth is where the historical society really embodies James's torment. Like I mentioned earlier, the level design leaves players disoriented to put us on the same level as our main character. After being teased by Maria, James struggles with his desires to embrace this idealized version of Mary and his desires to be punished for what he's done. The labyrinth is even spread amongst 2 floors, which also helps with this duality of the character's mindset. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it's not an accident that we can just casually stumble upon Pyramid Head here. Once we get to Maria, she's dead. It's left ambiguous if that was Pyramid Head's doing or not, but once again, the historical society, more so than any other location, seems to be taunting James. The final level is the hotel where the couple stayed at when they visited Silent Hill. It is relatively more tame compared to the previous location, but there are significant aspects to it, as one would expect of a final level. At this point, James has explicitly said he's not sure how Mary died. This doubt is triggered after killing Eddie, which is almost too on the nose about what really happened to his wife, at least in hindsight. He's almost ready to accept the truth. His guard is almost down. The level design tries to put us in his shoes by making us stash all our weapons before descending to the basement. There's not a lot of enemies in this section, but the feeling of vulnerability is pretty intense on a first-time playthrough. When arriving at the hotel, James remarks on how it hasn't changed one bit in the last 3 years. But once he reaches room 312 and watches the tape of him murdering his wife, the hotel becomes decrepit. It has burned down and suffered water damage. The pristine version of the hotel is symbolic of James's wish to go back to a past where things were still good. Once that reality is confirmed to be impossible, the water damage indicates James being at his lowest point. Remember, one of his alternatives is to kill himself by drowning. You have to imagine that water has associations with punishment in James's mind. I want to shout out the part right after watching the tape where the corridor doors stop making physical sense. I think it's a neat way of conveying the idea that James is just aimlessly wandering through the hotel after the shock of his revelation. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but that's how it felt to me. I already outlined how the other 2 endings line up with different secondary characters, so that just leaves us with Leave as the ending that best fits James. Let me preface my analysis by saying I don't think any of the endings are meant to be canon. They work much better as explorations of how people deal with guilt. That being said, the developers did remove Mary's suffocation audio because it made it hard for people to empathize with James, so on some level, they wanted us to see him as redeemable. In Leave, James leaves Silent Hill with Laura. The implication seems to be that he honors Mary's wish and adopts the girl. As much of a tragedy as the couple's story turned out to be, this is sort of a happy ending, whether James deserves it or not. In a way, it's very reminiscent of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, the book that inspired Takayoshi Sato to write the game's plot. The book tells the story of Raskolnikov, a poor man who decides to kill an old pawnbroker under the pretense that he would do much better things for society with her money than the mean old lady ever would. He's then haunted by his guilt and, in the end, confesses to his crimes. In the epilogue, we see that taking accountability for his actions and opening up to another character named Sonia allowed him to find redemption. Throughout the book, Sonia's faith clashes with Raskolnikov's worldview, but in the end, it's through religion that he finds salvation. Similarly, James and Laura constantly butt heads in almost every cutscene they're together, but in the end, adopting her is the only way Mary's will can live on and James can be released of his internal guilt. Leave is also the ending that starts with the most points cashed in towards it, which is another indicator of intent. Or maybe the devs just think more people would appreciate a happier ending, who knows. But this is a good time to talk about the method the game uses to determine which ending players get. Silent Hill 2 keeps track of a hidden points counter for each of the endings. Certain actions can increase or decrease the amount of points for any of the discussed options. Before the final boss, the game tallies up which ending has the most points and changes things accordingly. For the Maria ending, the game takes into account how much time you spend near her. If you take care not to bump into her, protect her from monsters, check back on her in the hospital and in the Historical Society labyrinth. It also loses points if you often look at Mary's photo and letter, and if you listen to Mary's hospital bed pleading all the way to the end.
I told you to go! Are you deaf? Don't come back! James! Wait! Please don't go! Stay with me!
Players have to act like they prioritize Maria over Mary to get this ending. For the in-water ending, the game mostly tracks James's health. If the player leaves his health on the red for most of the playthrough, the game reads it as an indication of James having low self-preservation instincts. Exposing him to certain imagery can also increase chances of getting this ending, such as Angela's knife, the diary of a suicidal patient on the rooftop of the hospital, and the graffiti on Neely's bar that tells James that he should just die if he really wants to see Mary. Finally, to get the leave ending, players must preserve James's health and display more interest in Mary than Maria. Healing to full health when necessary, listening to Mary's sickbed monologue, examining her letter and photo, etc. This ending positions itself as the middle path between Eddie's denial of culpability and Angela's embrace of death. The key aspect that elevates all of this is the hidden part of the hidden points counter. Because players don't know their actions are being tallied, the game aims to hit them at their unconscious perception of the main character. To try to understand this a bit better, I did some research on the relationship players developed with their avatars. Jamie Banks and Nicholas David Bowman are the names that popped up most prominently in the studies of player-avatar relationships. In 2015, Banks published a paper titled Object, Me, Symbiote, Other, a social topology of player-avatar relationships, in which she enumerates 4 types of relationships players can develop with their digital counterparts. The first type is the avatar as object relationship, in which players don't really identify their avatar as a social being, but rather as a tool with which they can exert their will on the game world. Banks' research is mostly based on interviewing World of Warcraft players, but I find it can be applied to all types of games. The avatar as object relationship fits pretty well with how most players relate to a character like Mario in the original Super Mario Bros. Other than being vaguely humanoid and whatever else you might be able to glean from reading the manual, Mario has almost no human traits to identify with. He's basically a tool to facilitate play. It's important to note that these relationship types are very subjective from person to person, so maybe if you're an Italian plumber playing the first Mario, you might identify with the character more than other people typically would, for example. Avatar as me is the type where players see avatars as extensions of themselves. The avatar is no longer just a tool, but a person. There's an element of care like one would have for a favorite t-shirt or a childhood toy, where an object gains meaning as an extension of one's personality. I think these types of relationships are mostly found in Western RPGs like Skyrim or Mass Effect, where the main character is a person in the game world but has no personality outside of what the player breathes into it, commonly referred to as a blank slate. There are many ways a player can approach a character like this, but for this player-avatar relationship, I'm talking about the type of player that pretends that the character is themselves in the game world. At the other end of the spectrum is the avatar as a social other. In this relationship type, the avatar is perceived as its own individual, separate from the player, with its own history and personality. It's more easily found in games with a prominent character-focused narrative component like The Last of Us or The Witcher. Witcher games in particular are a good example because they offer a considerable amount of player choice, but it's not unusual to see players making choices based on how they think Geralt would act instead of how they would act. Lastly, we have the avatar as symbiote relationship, in which players intertwine with their avatars. The study describes it as a connection in which there's a degree of personality negotiation between the two parties. Quote, "The player does not merely wear the avatar as a mask or costume. Rather, both player and avatar engage in cooperative processes of becoming more alike, usually towards an ideal self. In other words, players engaging in these player-avatar relationships craft ideal or alternate personas. For example, sober, brave, strong, happy, social, independent, and then use the avatar to practice being that persona." Unquote. It seems this type of relationship results from a player projecting their personalities into their avatar along with their inner thoughts and desires about themselves, almost as a way of manifesting their unconscious in some material capacity. With these concepts in mind, I want to bring things back to Silent Hill 2. Throughout the game, most player relationships with James are probably that of the avatar as a social other. After all, at the very beginning of the game, we are told this guy has a tragic backstory. Even his motivation for going to Silent Hill seems nonsensical, but understandable enough that it's easy to imagine James as a real person separate from us as players. However, by the end, the game pulls the rug from under us. Our actions have been defying James' canonical behavior. This revelation unwillingly intertwines the player with James almost as though our relationship was secretly that of an avatar as a symbiote, shining a mirror into our thoughts and perceptions about the game's subject matter. By concealing our impact on James's fate, we play through Silent Hill 2 treating him as a social other. We may pity him or hate him, we may act like he cares for Maria or only for Mary. There's a possibility our perceptions of the character translate into our playstyle, whether we recognize it or not, and the game is then ready to make that fact evident. I think this is why, in the end, Silent Hill 2 managed to resonate with horror fans harder than any other game in the genre I can think of. With this in mind, the use of symbolism and Freudian influences makes a lot more sense. The game is from the very beginning trying to access the player's psyche. How much it succeeds in that attempt is bound to vary from person to person, but the game's long-lasting renown seems to be a good indicator that it pulled off something unlike any other game has managed to up to that point, and maybe ever will. At the beginning of the video, I spoke about the designer's intent for creating fear for the flesh. The most terrifying aspect of Silent Hill 2's approach to horror is in presenting us with a character that lacks that instinct of self-preservation because he doesn't feel he deserves it, and then using interactivity to make us empathize with and project onto said character. How similar are we to James after all? It instills a paradoxical fear. It's being afraid of no longer being afraid. At the time of recording, the story of Silent Hill 2 is set to be retold in two different formats, a remake by Bloober Team and a movie adaptation by Christoph Gans, the director of the original 2006 film. Personally, the remake feels unnecessary given how well the original holds up. A proper remaster would be enough to reintroduce the game to a new audience. Of course, I wish Bloober Team all the luck in the world. If they nail this, it could be something really special. The movie, on the other hand, is what I'm honestly a lot more worried about. Throughout the video, I've built up the argument that Silent Hill 2's most important aspect is its approach to interactivity and the relationship being built between James and the player. Multiple endings aside, even the most faithful retelling of the story could never capture this crucial aspect of the game. Hopefully the movie still manages to be good on its own merits, but the experience we've been dissecting on this video is one that only a video game could ever give us. Silent Hill 2 is poised to remain a high watermark not only for horror games, but for the potential video games have as a medium for storytelling. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Just showing up here at the end to say, did you know I'm making a game? It's called Tyrant's Twilight. It is a strategy RPG with real-time elements to it. You're seeing it on the screen right now. If you like the way I think about video games, a lot of the things I talk about in my videos are things that I want to apply to my own game. And so if you think that's cool, if you want to support it, click the link below, wishlist it on Steam, and join the Discord server. There is a beta coming up really soon, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.